The contract was already on the table. The pen was already in his hand. $200 million, 3 years of negotiations, and a deal that was supposed to change everything, and the only person in that entire room who understood what was actually being signed was the waitress refilling the water glasses. Nobody asked her. Nobody looked at her. Nobody thought for a single second that the quiet black girl in the apron holding a notepad was about to stop a room full of powerful men dead in their tracks and change the course of all their lives forever. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The restaurant had a certain kind of silence that money buys. Not the quiet of an empty room, but the cultivated hush of a place where the staff moved like shadows and every conversation at every table was treated as classified. Oleander's was the kind of establishment where the menus had no prices, where the lighting was engineered to make everyone look more important than they probably were, and where a reservation required either a name that opened doors or a phone call from someone whose name did. Daniel Reeves had both. He arrived at 14 minutes past 2, which in his world counted as prompt. He was the kind of man who filled a doorway without being physically large, not because of his height or his build, but because of the particular way he moved through space, as if rooms had been arranged in advance for his convenience. Mid-40s, silver threading into the hair at his temples. A suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His assistant had already confirmed the table, already arranged the private room at the back where the lighting was warmer and the acoustics were kinder to conversation. He paused near the entrance and straightened his cufflinks, a small, unconscious gesture, then followed the host through the main floor toward the private dining room. Behind him came 2 men. The first was Karim al-Sayed. He was a compact man in his late 50s with close-cropped gray hair and dark, unhurried eyes that missed nothing. His suit was understated in the way that only the very wealthy can afford to be understated. No flash, no branding, just quality so complete it needed no announcement. He walked with the ease of someone who had spent decades in rooms like this, who had signed agreements that moved borders as much as money. He had flown in from abroad, and yet he showed no sign of travel fatigue, no creased jacket, no jet-lagged slowness in his gaze. The second man was Victor Hale. Victor was the kind of person you noticed because he wanted to be noticed. His suit was dark charcoal, fitted just sharp enough to signal ambition, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had made himself indispensable. He was Daniel's translator, the bridge between English and Arabic, between American business culture and the customs of al-Sayed's world. He had been in this role for 4 years. He had navigated deals across 2 continents. Daniel trusted him the way you trust a tool that has never broken, completely and without much thought. The private room was set for 3. A round table draped in white linen, crystal glassware, a leather folder at the center containing the contract. On the cover of the folder, a small gold embossed insignia that meant absolutely nothing to most people and everything to a very specific few, a deal worth over $200 million. Daniel sat down and reached for the water already poured in his glass. Karim settled across from him with that same unhurried ease. Victor took the 3rd chair and placed a slim leather portfolio beside his plate. He pulled out a pen, clicked it once, out of habit, the same way someone might crack their knuckles before a game, and smiled at no one in particular. The contract would be signed today. That had been the plan for 6 weeks. A strategic partnership with al-Sayed's consortium, one that would extend Daniel's company into new international markets, open supply chains, government-adjacent infrastructure. It was, as Victor had described it in half a dozen preparatory meetings, a generational opportunity. The waitress who brought their water did not announce herself. She simply appeared at the table, graceful and unhurried, setting down a small bread basket, refilling the glasses, tucking a cloth smoothly over her arm. Her name tag read Naomi. She was in her early 20s, slender, with natural hair pulled back in a soft bun and a face that held the particular stillness of someone who had learned early that being unnoticed was often the safest way to move through a room. She had worked at Oleander's for 11 months. She was good at her job in the way that goes unremarked, always there, never in the way, anticipating what the table needed before anyone asked. The senior staff liked her. The manager, a tightly wound man named Gregory Walsh, tolerated her because she never gave him a reason not to. She set the breadbasket down between the men and turned to go. Then Victor began to speak. He was translating for Kareem, who had just said something in Arabic, a greeting, a pleasantry about the room. Daniel smiled and nodded. Victor's version was smooth, polished, complete. A perfectly natural sentence delivered in perfectly natural English. Naomi had already taken 3 steps away from the table. She stopped. Not visibly, not the kind of stop that turns heads. Just a fractional hesitation in her stride, the way you might pause when you hear a familiar name in a crowd. She adjusted the cloth on her arm. She did not turn around. Because what Victor had just said in English was not what Kareem had said in Arabic. It was close. That was the thing that made it unsettling. It was close enough that anyone who didn't know the language would never catch it. The sense of it was the same. The feeling was different. Kareem had said something warm, deferential. Victor had translated it in a way that was warm but subtly assured, subtly weighted, like turning a handshake into a contract. Naomi walked back toward the service corridor. She stood just inside the arch, straightening a stack of napkins that didn't need to be straightened, and she listened. Arabic had come to her sideways, the way most of her languages had. Growing up in a neighborhood where the apartment building had more countries in it than the UN, you either learned to listen or you learned to stay inside. Naomi had always been a listener. Her mother's best friend was Sudanese. The family upstairs had been Lebanese. A boy she'd gone to school with from the time they were 7 until they were 16 had parents who refused to speak anything but classical Arabic at home, and because Naomi had spent half her afternoons in that house eating flatbread and doing homework at their kitchen table, she had absorbed it, not academically, not from a textbook, but through the slow osmosis of presence. She understood approximately 70% of a natural conversation. She could follow the current of it, the tones, the idioms. She was not fluent, but she was not ignorant. And what she was hearing from this table was not simple. Kareem spoke again. She heard it clearly. Something about the arrangement being, he hoped, mutually limited in the initial phase, a capped scope. He used a word that specifically meant bounded, like a fence around a field. Victor translated, "He says he hopes the arrangement will provide mutual security and establish a lasting foundation." Naomi's hand stilled on the napkins. Lasting foundation. That was almost the opposite of what Kareem had said. Not aggressively wrong. Not, "He wants to burn the building down," when Kareem had said, "He wants to open a window." But the meaning had been rotated, quietly, like a dial turned a few degrees. What Kareem had described as a temporary scoped first phase had become, in Victor's version, a permanent and stabilizing structure. She made herself pick up the napkins and walk back to the service station. She put them down on the counter. Picked them up again. "Don't," she told herself. "You're a waitress. This is a $200 million table. You heard it wrong. Your Arabic isn't that good." But she kept hearing it again, the word he'd used, the specific word for bounded. It was not the kind of word you mixed up with its opposite. She looked back at the table. The leather contract folder had been opened. Daniel was reading through the first pages while Victor spoke quietly to Kareem in Arabic. Low, rapid, efficient. Kareem nodded along with the careful patience of a man who was either completely comfortable or very good at appearing so. Daniel turned to a middle section of the document and tapped a clause asking something. Victor leaned in. Naomi watched Victor's hands. He used them when he spoke, a habit, a kind of elegant emphasis, the hands of a man who had trained himself to appear credible. She watched him gesture toward the contract, watched the assurance in his posture, the way he turned to include Kareem with a look that said, "We are all in agreement here, aren't we?" And then she watched Kareem. Kareem did not respond the way Victor implied he would. His agreement was more careful, measured. He said a few words that Victor translated as enthusiastic confirmation, but to Naomi's ears, Kareem had said something closer. To that depends on what is meant by the term. Victor did not translate that part. Her heart was beating faster than she wanted it to. Gregory Walsh appeared at her elbow. "Table 4 needs their mains cleared," he said, not looking at her. "Yes," she said, and went. She cleared table 4. She took an order at table 7. She brought an amuse-bouche to a couple near the window who were celebrating something, an anniversary or a birthday. The woman kept laughing and touching her collarbone. Naomi smiled at them and moved on. All of it happened at a remove. Her body was doing the work her shift required, but her mind was still in that private room, still replaying the Arabic, still turning the words over like coins to check which side they showed. She refilled the bread basket at the private table and heard Kareem say 3 words that pulled every thought she'd been wrestling with into sudden cold focus. Permanent stake security. That was what Victor translated. What Kareem had said was limited partnership duration. Not close this time, not a dial turned a few degrees. These were 2 entirely different phrases with entirely different implications. The first was a guarantee, a lock. The second was a ceiling, a limit. The contract folder was open. A pen had appeared in Daniel's hand. The conversation had reached that particular rhythm where everything was wrapping up, where the formalities give way to the moment everyone has been building toward. Victor was nodding and smiling. Kareem had his hands folded on the table. Daniel uncapped the pen. Naomi thought about her job. She thought about the 6 months it had taken her to get hired here, the 2 rounds of interviews, the reference checks. She thought about her rent, her mother's phone bills, the savings account that barely deserved the name. She thought about Gregory Walsh's face when he found out. Then she thought about the phrase limited partnership duration becoming permanent stake security on its way across a table, and what that did to a man who was about to put his name on something. She stepped forward. She did not make a scene. She did not raise her voice. She leaned in slightly at the edge of the table, the way you do when you've spotted something the guest hasn't, a fork set on the wrong side, a glass in the wrong place. And she spoke in a tone that was quiet and direct and entirely impossible to dismiss. "Sir, your translator is lying." Everything stopped. It was the kind of stillness that follows something that cannot be unsaid. Daniel looked up from the contract with the slow, deliberate motion of a man who believed he had misheard. Victor's smile did not disappear. It became a different kind of smile, the kind that contains its own argument. Kareem said nothing. He simply looked at Naomi with those dark, unhurried eyes. And she had the disorienting sensation that whatever she saw in them was not surprise. Gregory Walsh materialized from somewhere with the speed of a man who had spent his entire career anticipating disasters. "I'm so sorry," he said, stepping between Naomi and the table like a curtain being drawn. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Reeves. She's—" "What did you just say?" Daniel asked. He was speaking to Naomi, not to Gregory. Victor laughed, a short, calibrated sound. "She's a waitress," he said, with a particular emphasis that was meant to end the conversation. "I apologize for this. She clearly misheard something." "What did I mishear?" Naomi asked. "This is a private negotiation," Victor said, his voice still pleasant, but now with a seam of something colder running through it. "Do you even speak the language? And do you have any idea how technically specific this kind of legal Arabic is?" "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to—" Gregory began. "I heard what he said," Naomi said, looking at Daniel. Not at Victor, at Daniel. Mr. Al-Sayed said limited partnership duration. That's not what your translator told you. The room held its breath. Daniel Reeves set the pen down. It made almost no sound against the linen, but in the stretched quiet of that moment, it was the loudest thing in the room. He leaned back in his chair, not relaxing, settling, the way a man settles when he's deciding whether to engage or dismiss, when he's calculating the cost of both. "You have about 30 seconds, he said to Naomi, to explain what you mean. Gregory Walsh made a sound that was not quite a word. His hand was still hovering near Naomi's elbow, not touching her, but present, a reminder of its authority. She could feel his distress radiating outward like heat. Victor had already reorganized himself. The laugh was gone. In its place was something more useful, a measured professional patience, the expression of a man who has been interrupted by the unreasonable before and has learned that the best response is a kind of tired tolerance. "She's a floor waitress," Victor said, addressing Daniel rather than acknowledging Naomi directly. "I've been doing this for 4 years. This negotiation requires familiarity with formal legal register, regional dialectical variation, and—" "Can you or can you not speak Arabic?" Daniel asked Naomi. "Not fluently," she said. "But I understand it well enough to know that what he said and what you heard were not the same thing." "Not fluently," Victor repeated, and let the words sit there. Karim al-Sayed had not moved. He had not spoken. He was watching Naomi with an attention that was so complete and so still it was almost unsettling, like the attention of someone watching a performance they had already seen and wanted to confirm was being done right. "Mr. Al-Sayed said limited partnership duration," Naomi said again. She kept her voice even. She was not going to let it shake. He used the phrase in Arabic. The word he used means bounded, like a limit, a ceiling. Your translator told you he was discussing permanent stake security. Those are not the same thing. They're not even close to the same thing. "She's mistaken," Victor said. "Or the phrasing in formal legal Arabic is more nuanced than a casual listener would be able to parse. What she's interpreting as a limitation is actually a standard clause describing—" "Ask him," Naomi said. Victor stopped. Daniel looked at her. "Ask Mr. Al-Sayed yourself," she said. "Direct question. Ask him whether the initial phase of this arrangement is meant to be open-ended or whether it has a defined scope. Then let's see what your translator gives you." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the ones before it. This one had an edge. Daniel turned to Karim. "Tell me in your own words," Daniel said carefully, "how you see the initial phase of this partnership. Is there a ceiling on scope?" Karim tilted his head, listening as Victor translated the question, or the version of it that Victor chose to translate. Then he spoke. Naomi heard him say, clearly, that he had always understood the arrangement to operate within agreed boundaries in the early stages, that the scope was intentionally limited at first. Victor translated, "He says the arrangement is designed to offer full, flexible integration from the start, with scope that grows naturally to meet both parties' evolving interests." Naomi looked at Daniel. "He said the scope is limited in the early stages," she said. "He said the boundaries were intentional." The temperature in the room changed. Daniel looked from Naomi to Victor to Karim. His jaw had set in the way it sets when a man is doing math in his head and not liking the totals. "Those are different answers," Daniel said very quietly. Victor began. "They're different answers," Daniel said again, not louder, just final. Karim's expression shifted. It was a small shift, barely perceptible. Not alarm, not guilt, something closer to interest. He looked at Naomi and said a single word in Arabic, softly, that she understood to mean careful or precise. It was not addressed to anyone in particular. It wasn't entirely clear whether it was a warning or a compliment. Gregory Walsh had stopped trying to intervene. He was standing near the door now, caught between his instinct to protect the restaurant's reputation and the growing awareness that something real was happening at this table, something above his management-grade authority to redirect. Victor turned to Naomi with the full force of his professionalism. "I want to be respectful," he said, in a tone that wanted to be interpreted as respectful. "But you are putting yourself in a very serious situation here. You're interfering with a legally sensitive international negotiation. You're making claims about language competency you've already admitted you don't have, and the reputational damage alone." "Translate a clause," Daniel said. Victor looked at him. "Give her a clause from the contract," Daniel said. "Let her read it." "Daniel, this is—" "I'm not asking." The table went very quiet. Victor's expression did something complicated, a brief, almost invisible calculation running behind his eyes, and then he reached for the contract folder and slid it across the linen toward Naomi. She looked at it. Then she pulled it closer. The clause in question was on the 3rd page, Section 4, Subsection 2. It was written in both English and Arabic, side by side, in the way that international contracts often are. The dual-language format meant to establish mutual understanding. She read the Arabic first, slowly, moving her lips slightly the way she always did when she was working through something she wanted to be sure of. Then she read the English. She set the folder down. "This clause," she said, "gives the right to restructure the operational terms of the partnership if the revenue targets in Appendix B aren't met within 18 months. She paused. The Arabic version says that right belongs to both parties equally. The English version says that right belongs to the consortium, which is Mr. Al-Sayed's company, only. The pen was still lying on the linen where Daniel had set it. He did not pick it up. Victor leaned forward. "That is a standard asymmetrical performance clause," he said, with the crisp authority of someone describing the properties of a well-known substance. "The asymmetry is intentional and was disclosed in the preliminary documentation. The Arabic reflects a more generalized principle. The English is the operative legal text. She's conflating." "Then why do they say different things?" Daniel asked. "Because legal language across jurisdictions." "Why do they say different things?" Daniel asked again. Victor opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. From the floor of the main restaurant, someone dropped a fork. The sound came through the private room's half-open door and broke the silence the way a stone breaks ice, not cleanly, but decisively. Gregory Walsh made his move. He stepped forward, placed himself gently between Naomi and the table, and spoke in the hushed, even tone of a man containing a fire. "Naomi, I need you on the floor. Now." She knew what was behind those words. She knew the shape of what came next. The quiet conversation in the service corridor, the write-up, the possibility that tomorrow her locker would be empty. She had been here before in smaller ways, in smaller rooms, smaller stakes. The moment where the cost of speaking became visible and you had to decide if what you were protecting was worth it. She was halfway to the door. Then she heard Victor say something to Kareem in Arabic, rapid, quiet, intended to fill the gap and re-establish momentum. She understood maybe half of it, but the half she understood told her he was summarizing the deal in favorable terms, pushing toward closure, trying to rebuild the room's agreement in the few seconds she was being removed from it. She turned around. She didn't intend to make it dramatic. She genuinely didn't. But her voice carried the way voices carry in rooms built for acoustics, and when she spoke, it reached every corner. "He's doing it again." Victor stopped. The couple at the anniversary table in the main dining room had gone quiet. Two servers near the pass were watching through the doorway. Gregory Walsh had gone the particular color of someone experiencing a professional emergency. Daniel Reeves pushed his chair back, stood up, and looked at the room. Then he said in a voice that did not need to be raised, "Nobody speaks. She translates. word for word. Everything that is said in this room from now on goes through her. The air rearranged itself. It was a remarkable thing to watch, the way a room shifts when the person at its center shifts their allegiance. Victor sat back. His posture did not crumble because he was too disciplined for that, but something inside it went slack, the way a sail goes slack when the wind changes direction. For the first time in the hours she had been watching this table, he looked like a man who was no longer sure of the terrain. Naomi stood at the edge of the table. She had never translated professionally. She had no certification, no portfolio, no institutional authority. She had a lived knowledge of a language absorbed through proximity and care, through years of listening to people speak to each other in the privacy of their own tongue. She was aware, acutely, that what she was doing was technically far beyond the role she had been hired to fill. She was also aware that the contract folder was still open on the table, and that somewhere inside it, a man's life's work was waiting to be transferred away from him. She started with the clause she'd already read. Then the next one. Daniel asked Kareem to respond to each one as she translated. Kareem answered, no longer filtered through Victor, no longer compressed and redirected. His Arabic came through to Naomi's ears, and she gave it back to Daniel as cleanly as she could, flagging the moments where she was unsure of a specific term, asking Kareem to repeat a phrase when she needed him to. The process was slow. It was halting in places. It was nothing like the smooth professional performance Victor had provided. It was also completely different from what Victor had provided. Clause by clause, Naomi worked through the document. She found the asymmetrical restructuring rights. She found a performance penalty clause that operated only against Daniel's company, not the consortium. She found a governing law provision that locked any dispute resolution into a jurisdiction where Kareem's business had deep pre-existing relationships. She found a definition of partnership that in the Arabic text carried implications of operational authority rather than shared equity. Each time she translated a clause, Daniel's expression moved through something that looked like the stages of grief running in fast forward, disbelief, then clarity, then a dark and settling fury that he kept very contained. Victor remained seated. He did not attempt further interruptions. He watched with the careful attention of a man who was already preparing his next position, by already building the version of events he would need for whatever came after. Kareem watched Naomi. She noticed it. The quality of his attention, the way it had not changed since she first stepped forward. Not hostile, not alarmed, something patient and evaluating, as if he were watching a clock run and was already certain of the time it would show when it stopped. When she finished the last clause in the main body of the contract, the table was quiet for a long moment. Then Kareem spoke. He spoke directly to Naomi in Arabic, unhurried. She listened. Then she looked at Daniel. He says, she said carefully, now we can finally have an honest conversation. Daniel stared at him. She watched understanding move across Daniel's face. Not anger, not relief, but something stranger and more unsettling. But the kind of understanding that makes you go back and reread every previous moment and ask what it meant if this is what it was building toward. Kareem had known. He had known the whole time. The words hung in the air the way smoke hangs, shapeless at first, then slowly forming into something you could read. Now we can finally have an honest conversation. Daniel Reeves was still standing. He hadn't sat back down after ordering Victor to be quiet, and now that stillness had a different quality. The stillness of a man who had just learned that the ground beneath him was not the ground he thought he was standing on. He looked at Kareem with the particular expression of someone recalculating not just the present moment, but every moment that had led to it. You knew, Daniel said. It wasn't a question. Naomi translated it. Kareem listened. All then responded in Arabic, calm as a man describing the weather. She turned to Daniel. He says he had suspicions. He says he allowed things to continue so he could understand the full shape of what was happening. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. He says he needed to see how far it would go. Daniel absorbed this. He used me as bait, Naomi translated. Kareem gave a small, measured response. He says that's not how he'd describe it. He says he allowed a situation to develop so that the responsible party would reveal himself. She kept her voice neutral. He says the deal was never going to be signed today. Victor, who had been sitting with the controlled stillness of a man managing his internal weather, looked up at that. Something moved behind his eyes, something between fury and the kind of cold assessment that comes right before a decision. That's convenient, Victor said, addressing the table rather than any one person. He waited until after a waitress made accusations to clarify that the deal was never happening. Does anyone else find the timing of that statement interesting? Kareem looked at Victor for the first time in several minutes. He said something short and direct. Naomi translated. He says the timing is exactly the point. Daniel sat back down. He placed both hands flat on the table and looked at the contract folder. Still open, still laid out in its leather casing, like a map of somewhere he'd almost gone. Then he looked at Naomi. Stay, he said. I have tables. I'll square it with your manager. He glanced toward the door where Gregory Walsh had retreated. Please. Naomi looked at the door, then back at the table. She pulled out the chair beside Daniel and sat down, folding her hands in her lap, doing her best to make the posture feel natural. It didn't entirely work. She had never in her life sat at a table like this one, in a room like this one, between men like these. She told herself to listen. She was best when she was listening. Victor leaned forward. He had reorganized himself again, the composure restored, the argument rebuilt. When he spoke, his voice carried the patient authority of a man presenting a correction to an honest misunderstanding. What she translated isn't wrong, he said, but it's incomplete. The clauses she identified, the restructuring rights, the arbitration provisions, those were disclosed and negotiated. The asymmetry wasn't hidden. It was a concession in exchange for the revenue guarantee on Kareem's side. He opened his own portfolio and slid a page across the table. Preliminary discussion notes dated 6 weeks ago. You signed off on the general framework. Daniel looked at the page. His expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. That's the framework, Naomi said quietly. She had read the page as soon as it landed on the table. The specific clause language is different. The framework describes shared restructuring rights. The contract executes them as unilateral. Legal drafting evolves between framework and execution, Victor said. It usually evolves toward clarity, Naomi said, not away from it. Victor looked at her for a moment, a long, a measuring look that she held without looking away. Then he turned back to Daniel. She's not wrong that the language changed, he said, but the reason it changed is technical, not fraudulent. There are dialect variations in formal commercial Arabic that don't map cleanly to a single English equivalent. What reads as asymmetry in her translation is actually a standard bilateral protection under. He's mixing truth with distortion, Naomi said. Everyone looked at her. She hadn't meant to say it aloud, or maybe she had. She wasn't entirely sure. But now that it was out, she kept going. He's not entirely lying, she said to Daniel. Some of what he's saying is accurate. The framework does support his argument in places, but he's using the accurate parts to cover the inaccurate ones. He knows exactly where the real problems are, which means he knows exactly how to talk around them. Victor spread his hands in a gesture of frustrated patience. This is the problem with partial fluency, he said. You hear enough to feel certain. You don't hear enough to be right. Then explain the arbitration clause, Naomi said. Victor paused. If it's a standard bilateral protection, Explain why all disputes go to a jurisdiction where Mr. Al-Sayed's firm has a standing relationship with the presiding court system. She kept her voice steady. That's not a translation issue. That's in the English text. Plain language. A beat of silence. Then Daniel said, very quietly, "Victor." The question that followed wasn't about the contract. It was about the years before it. Daniel didn't ask it out loud, not directly, but Naomi watched it move across his face. He watched him look at Victor with the dawning, ugly awareness of a man who has trusted someone across a long stretch of time and is now pulling that trust backward through every decision they made together, checking each one for damage. Victor had been with him for 4 years. There had been other deals, other contracts, other rooms like this one, other tables with other men across them, and Victor's voice, the bridge between Daniel's world and theirs. How many of those bridges had been built slightly crooked? How many had held weight they shouldn't have? Naomi watched Daniel think this and said nothing. It wasn't her place to name it. She turned her attention to Kareem instead, not conspicuously, not in a way that announced itself. Just the shift of a listener's focus, the way you adjust your ear when you want to catch something specific. Kareem was watching the exchange between Daniel and Victor with that same settled composure he had carried all afternoon. Patient, present, nothing agitated in his posture or his expression. He had the quality of a man who had come to a room knowing how it would end and was willing to wait for it to get there. And that, Naomi realized, was the thing that had been bothering her. Not Victor. Victor made sense now, or was beginning to. A hired manipulator running a strategy he'd run before, this time in a room where the wrong person happened to understand the language. Victor was a specific kind of dangerous, calculated, adaptable, but ultimately reactive. He moved in response to the situation. Kareem didn't move in response to anything. She thought back to the beginning of the afternoon. But the moment she had first caught the mistranslation and gone still in the middle of the dining floor. She had been watching Victor, thinking about Victor, measuring the gap between what was said and what was translated. But Kareem had been present for all of it. Kareem had spoken those words, and he had kept speaking them, kept letting Victor translate them however Victor chose, for the entire first hour. Not because he didn't know what was happening, because he wanted to see what Naomi would do. She asked Kareem a question. She addressed him directly in Arabic, not to show off, not to perform, but because it was the fastest way to what she needed. She asked about the original proposal documentation, when it was drafted, who drafted it, what language it was drafted in first. Kareem answered smoothly. His Arabic was clear, careful. The Arabic of an educated man who knew exactly what he was saying. He described the drafting process in a way that implicated Victor fully and positioned himself as a party who had received a proposal in translation. Naomi listened. Then she asked a follow-up, a specific, quiet question about a phrase he had used in his answer, a phrase that she recognized, a phrase that wasn't from the discussion going on now. It was from the original contract text, Section 7, a clause she had translated 20 minutes ago. Kareem stopped, just for a moment, just long enough. He quoted the contract, she said to Daniel, keeping her voice low. Verbatim, Section 7, a clause that was never read aloud in this room. Daniel looked at her. Meaning? Meaning he already knows the contract. He didn't need Victor to translate any of it. She paused. He's been speaking to Victor in Arabic this whole time, and Victor has been mistranslating for your benefit. But Kareem knows English well enough to know exactly what was being mistranslated. The room did something difficult and slow, like a machine changing gears. He wasn't manipulated, Daniel said. He was part of it, Naomi said. At least some of it. I'm not sure how much. Victor stood up, not aggressively. There was nothing violent in the movement. He stood the way a man stands when he has decided that sitting is no longer strategic. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his portfolio. "I think," he said in a tone that was almost conversational, "that we've reached the limit of what a productive conversation looks like today." "Sit down," Daniel said. "Daniel, sit down." Victor sat. But the act of standing had been its own kind of statement, a reminder that he was not a prisoner at this table, that there were doors and exits and a world outside this room that was not governed by Daniel Reeves's instruction. Daniel turned to Kareem, not to Naomi, not to Victor, directly to Kareem. "Tell me what this actually is," he said. Naomi translated it into Arabic. Kareem listened. Then he said calmly, "That business always favors the prepared." He said it without apology and without particular emphasis, the way you state a fact you have always believed and never found worth arguing about. Naomi gave Daniel the translation. Daniel received it without expression. It was not a confession. It was not a denial. It was the kind of statement that occupied the space between both and made the room feel suddenly smaller. About an hour had passed since Naomi first stepped forward at the table. The bread basket was long cold. The water glasses had gone unrefilled. Gregory Walsh had stopped appearing at the door. The restaurant beyond the private room was moving through its early evening shift change. She could hear it faintly, the clatter and murmur of a floor settling into a different rhythm, and it felt very far away, like the sounds of a country she had left without planning to. Naomi was still at the table. She had her notepad in front of her now, the small one she used for orders, the one with the restaurant's logo on the cover. She had been writing things down, phrases from the contract, the Arabic originals beside the English versions, notes on what matched and what didn't, and where the gap between the two was small enough to be argued as interpretation, and where it was too wide to be anything but deliberate. Daniel was on his phone, speaking in the clipped, careful language of a man making calls he wished he didn't have to make. His legal team, someone senior. The calls weren't going the way he wanted. She could tell by the pauses, the way his expression tightened and then deliberately smoothed itself out again. Victor was seated across from her. He hadn't left, which she found interesting. A guilty man with an exit strategy would have taken the exit. Victor stayed, which meant either he had nowhere useful to go or he was still working an angle she hadn't identified yet. She looked at him. He looked back at her without looking away. There was something in his expression she couldn't fully categorize. Not hostility, not the defensive brightness she'd expect from someone trying to talk their way out of a corner. Something more like assessment, like he was watching a variable in a calculation update in real time and was adjusting the rest of his math accordingly. Kareem was quiet. He had retreated into a kind of courteous neutrality, answering direct questions when addressed and otherwise simply being present. He had his phone on the table, face down. He had not looked at it once. Naomi went back to her notepad. She had been right about Victor mixing truth and distortion. She was more certain of that now than before. But the thing that was beginning to worry her, the thing she hadn't been able to set down since she first thought it, was that the mixing wasn't random. And it wasn't a man improvising dishonesty under pressure. The specific places where Victor's translation stayed accurate and the specific places where it shifted, they had a pattern. The accurate parts were the parts Daniel would check, the technical provisions, the payment schedules, the headline terms. Any lawyer reviewing the contract would verify those against the Arabic and find them clean. The distortions were in the interpretive language, the definitions, the governing clauses, the provisions that only mattered when something went wrong, the parts you didn't read carefully until you were already in a dispute. This wasn't opportunistic fraud. This was engineered. She was writing this down, slowly, working through it, when she found the clause. It was in the appendices, Section 12, subsection 4, buried in a block of dense legal text that managed to be both very long and very unremarkable looking. She had almost skipped past it. She read it twice in English. Then she found the Arabic version and read it twice there. They matched. Both versions said the same thing. Which was the problem? Because what they both said, clearly, unambiguously in both languages, was that in the event of any interpretive dispute arising from the contract, all arbitration would be conducted under the jurisdiction of a named international body. An arbitration body that Naomi had never heard of, which was not in itself suspicious. What was suspicious was the clause's definition of interpretive dispute. It was so broad that it would effectively cover any disagreement about any provision in the contract. And the named arbitration body's rules, which were referenced by citation rather than reproduced in full, were not included in the document she was looking at. She didn't need to see those rules to understand what they probably said. No matter who translated this contract, no matter how accurately, no matter how honestly, if Daniel and Kareem ever disagreed about anything in it, the resolution happened somewhere Daniel had no foothold. "It doesn't matter who translates," she said aloud. Daniel ended his call and looked at her. "The arbitration clause," she said. "It's in both languages. Victor didn't distort it. He didn't need to." She turned her notepad around so Daniel could see her notes. "If there's ever a dispute, it goes to an arbitration body whose rules aren't in this document. Daniel would always lose, regardless of what the contract actually says." The table went very quiet. Victor said nothing, which was, she had learned, how he confirmed things he couldn't afford to agree with out loud. "The whole contract is designed this way," she continued. "The translation issues were real. I wasn't wrong about those. But they're not the main event. They're insurance. If the mistranslations got caught, the arbitration clause is still there. Either way, whoever is on Kareem's side of this deal wins every legal challenge." Daniel set his phone down on the table. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Kareem. "You built a trap," he said. Naomi translated. Kareem listened. Then he smiled. Just slightly, the way a man smiles when someone has finally said the thing that makes the conversation worth having. He responded in Arabic. She translated. "He says he prefers to think of it as a system that favors preparation." She paused. "He says that's not the same thing as a trap." "What's the difference?" Daniel asked. Naomi asked Kareem. He answered. "He says a trap is set for someone who doesn't see it coming. A system rewards whoever understands it first." Daniel demanded transparency. He used the word directly, not as a euphemism, not as a polite framing. He set his hands flat on the table again, looked at both men, and said he wanted to know what this actually was, who was behind it, and whether there was any version of this deal that was honest. Kareem spoke at some length. Naomi translated as he went, pausing where she needed to, asking him to slow down once when he moved through a section too quickly. But what emerged from the translation was a picture that was more complex than simple fraud. The deal had been structured, Kareem explained, to shift operational leverage gradually. Not to steal anything outright. That was too crude, too visible. The mechanism was subtler. Daniel's company would remain his in name. The revenue guarantees were real, but over time, through the arbitration provisions, through the restructuring clause, through a series of performance benchmarks calibrated to be just achievable enough that Daniel would keep trying rather than exit, the effective control would migrate, slowly, legally. In ways that would be very difficult to argue against in any court because the argument would require proving intent rather than just mechanism. Victor had been part of it. Not the architect. Kareem was clear about that. Victor had been hired to ensure that the English side understanding of the contract stayed slightly misaligned with the Arabic, not enough to fail a legal review, but enough to prevent Daniel from ever feeling the need to do one. "He wasn't the mastermind," Naomi said to Daniel. "That's what he's saying." "Then who was?" Daniel asked. Kareem looked at Victor. Victor looked at the table. Then he looked up. Not at Daniel, not at Kareem, but at Naomi. And he said, in a voice that was almost too quiet to catch, "You weren't supposed to be here." She held his gaze. "I work here." "I know," he said. "That's the problem." Naomi took a breath and pushed through what she was feeling. The strangeness of it, the weight of sitting in this chair, the surreal quality of being the person this table was now organized around, and focused. She picked up her notepad. She turned to the page where she had written out the arbitration clause verbatim, both language versions. She read it aloud in Arabic. Then she looked at Kareem and asked, in Arabic, whether that was a correct and complete representation of the clause's meaning, whether the interpretation she had just given was, in his understanding, valid. Kareem looked at her. She kept her eyes level. The question was simple, but what it was doing was not simple. If Kareem agreed that her interpretation was valid, he was confirming that he understood the clause the way she understood it, which meant he understood exactly what it did and had agreed to it knowingly. That confirmation, witnessed by Daniel, was the kind of thing that had legal weight. It was the kind of thing lawyers could use. Kareem was quiet for a moment. And his expression was the same as it had always been, settled, measured, giving nothing away voluntarily. Then he said in Arabic that her interpretation was reasonable but incomplete. Naomi wrote that down. Reasonable but incomplete, she told Daniel. He's not denying it. He's not confirming it fully. He's keeping himself one step removed. How do we remove that step? Daniel asked. I'm working on it, she said. And then Victor, who had been watching her write, said something none of them expected. Ask him about the addendum, Victor said. Section 14. It's not in the copy you have. Everyone looked at him. There's another version, Victor said. He wasn't addressing anyone in particular now, just releasing the words into the room with the careful steadiness of a man making a decision he had been sitting with for a while. A parallel document, signed by a proxy, through a structure that traces back to someone inside Daniel's company. Daniel's expression changed in a way that Naomi had not seen before. Not fury, not confusion. The specific contained stillness of someone who has just felt the floor drop an inch. Someone inside my company, Daniel repeated. A senior person, Victor said. Someone who has been in this deal from the beginning. He paused. Long before you were. The table was absolutely silent. Naomi looked at Victor and thought about what it meant that he was saying this now. Not earlier, not when it might have protected someone, not when it would have kept his own position intact. Now. After she had stripped the deal down to its mechanisms, after Kareem had confirmed indirectly but unmistakably that the system was real. She thought about what it meant that Victor had stayed in this room. Before she could finish the thought, Victor looked at her and said the thing that reoriented everything. By now, he said quietly, they've already taken control. The room held it for a moment. Then Daniel pushed back his chair and stood up. The contract folder was still on the table. The pen was still lying beside it, uncapped, where it had been set down nearly 2 hours ago. Naomi looked at it, then looked up at Daniel's face, and saw something there she hadn't expected to see. Not panic, but purpose. The kind of focus that comes when a man stops trying to understand a situation and starts trying to end it. We're leaving, Daniel said. He looked at Naomi. You're coming with me. The car was a black sedan, the kind that came with a driver and tinted windows and the particular quiet of expensive insulation. Daniel sat in the back with his phone pressed to his ear and his elbow on the door panel, watching the city move past the glass without really seeing it. Naomi sat beside him with her notepad on her knee and her hands folded over it, very still. She had never been in a car like this. She noted that fact somewhere in the back of her mind and then set it aside because there were more useful things to think about. Victor had not come with them. He had stayed at the table when they left. him and Kareem in that private room with the cold bread and the uncapped pen, and Naomi had watched him over her shoulder as she followed Daniel out. Victor had not looked up. He was staring at the table with the expression of a man doing the specific kind of arithmetic that involves consequences. She had thought about that the whole way to the car. Daniel ended his third call and immediately started a fourth. She heard fragments, authorized version, revised terms, who signed off, when, and watched the muscle in his jaw work steadily. The calls were not going the way he wanted. She could tell without hearing the other end. There was a rhythm to how he was listening, short and tight, not the easy rhythm of receiving confirmation. And twice he said something very controlled that she suspected was covering something considerably less controlled underneath. She looked down at her notepad. She had written out the arbitration clause in both languages. Beside it she had written Section 14, Parallel Document, Proxy, Shell Company, Insider, and below that, underlined twice, Already in Motion. Victor's words, sitting there in her own handwriting like an alarm that had already gone off. Daniel lowered the phone and looked out the window. "My legal team got a message 3 days ago," he said. He wasn't looking at her. "Telling them that the revised contract terms had been reviewed and approved. They assumed it came from me. I didn't send it." Naomi said nothing. "Someone sent it from inside my organization," he said, "using an internal authorization channel, meaning they had access to a level of the system that—" He stopped, started again. "That not many people have." "A senior person," Naomi said. She was thinking of what Victor had said. "Long before you were." Yes. Daniel turned from the window. He looked at her directly for the first time since they'd gotten in the car, and she saw something in his face that was harder to look at than the anger, a kind of stripped-back bewilderment, the expression of a man who had built something over many years and was now being shown the termite damage inside the walls. "I keep going back to the meetings, the ones leading up to today. Who was in them? Who was pushing for the timeline? Who kept saying we needed to close before the end of the quarter?" He didn't say the name, not yet. But she could see it sitting there behind his eyes, growing more certain with every sentence. "The proxy document Victor mentioned," Naomi said. "Do you know what entity it would have been filed under? I have a lawyer pulling everything right now." His phone buzzed. He looked at it. "That's her." He took the call. Naomi looked out the window. They were 20 minutes from his company's headquarters. She knew because the driver had said so when Daniel gave the address. 20 minutes to understand enough to walk into that building knowing what they were walking into. She opened her notepad to a clean page and started writing questions. The message came through while Daniel was still on the call with his lawyer. It arrived on his phone as a text from a number she didn't recognize. She only knew because he pulled the phone away from his ear, looked at the screen, and went very still in the way that means what you are reading is worse than what you expected. He held the phone so she could see it. The revised agreement was executed through Meridian Holdings on the 14th. It's done. Walk away from today, and you keep everything that matters. Naomi read it twice. Then she looked at Daniel. "Meridian Holdings," he said. "That's a shell company. It's connected to my firm through a holding structure that was set up 2 years ago for an acquisition that never went through. It's been sitting dormant." He paused. "Almost nobody knows it exists." "But someone does," she said. "Someone does." She wrote Meridian Holdings in her notepad and underlined it. Daniel's lawyer was talking again. She could hear the voice from the phone, clipped, professional, covering alarm with procedure. The lawyer had found a filing, an agreement executed on the 14th, 4 days ago, through Meridian Holdings, carrying a digital authorization signature from an internal executive-level channel. Legally valid under the international framework that the original deal had been structured within. Binding under the arbitration provision, the one Naomi had found in the appendices. The trap hadn't been at the restaurant table at all. The table had been theater. The real signing had already happened 4 days ago in a filing that nobody was meant to find until Daniel's name was on today's contract, and it was too late to undo any of it. She thought about what Kareem had said. This deal was always meant to move forward, with or without clarity. With or without clarity. With or without Daniel's informed consent. With or without a waitress who happened to speak enough Arabic to slow things down for 2 hours. "How long do we have?" she asked. Daniel was already asking his lawyer the same question. The answer, when it came, was that the Meridian filing would trigger its activation clause within 22 hours. After that, the operational restructuring it authorized would begin moving through legitimate legal channels, and unwinding it would require proving fraud in an arbitration body that had been pre-selected by the other side. 22 hours. She wrote that down too. Victor called as they pulled into the parking structure beneath Daniel's building. Daniel put it on speaker without hesitating, either because he wanted Naomi to hear or because he no longer had the energy to manage information in separate streams. Victor's voice came through the car's speakers, flat and stripped of its usual professional finish. "I need you to understand something before you go up there," Victor said. "I took this job because the money was significant and the work seemed contained. Translation with strategic framing. I've done it before, not like this, but adjacent to it. I'm not asking you to feel sympathetic about that." "I don't," Daniel said. "I know. What I'm telling you is that when I understood the full scope of what this was, I was already committed. There were people watching the process. If I'd pulled out early, I don't know what that would have looked like for me." A pause. "That's not an excuse. I'm explaining the structure." "Who's watching?" Daniel asked. "The people who put together the Meridian structure," Victor said. "They're not connected to Kareem directly. Kareem was recruited, same as me, a willing participant with his own incentives, but not the origin point." Another pause, longer this time. "The origin point is inside your building." Naomi looked at Daniel. He was staring at the phone. "The executive who's been running your international expansion strategy for the past 3 years, Victor said. "The one who identified Al-Sayed as the right partner. The one who designed the deal structure and brought me in. He told me you'd never question a translator you'd already been using for 4 years. A beat. He was almost right. The parking structure was very quiet around them. "Ethan," Daniel said. One word, very flat. Victor said nothing, which was confirmation enough. Naomi wrote the name down. Ethan Cole. She had heard Daniel mention him twice on the phone calls during the drive. Each time as a person he was trying to reach. Each time met with voicemail. Ethan wasn't answering because Ethan already knew. "There's one more thing," Victor said. "The reason I'm telling you this now, and not 3 hours ago, not 3 days ago, is that I didn't know about the Meridian filing until this afternoon. I thought the deal was contingent on today's signing. When you walked out without signing, I thought it was over." He paused. "When I realized it wasn't contingent at all, that it had already been done—" "You switched sides," Naomi said. A silence on the line. Then, "You weren't supposed to be in that room." "You said that already," she said. "I'm saying it again because I mean it differently this time," Victor said. "Not as a complaint, as a fact. The plan had no contingency for someone who could hear what was actually being said. It was considered an unnecessary contingency." A brief pause. Ethan considered it unnecessary. The call ended. Daniel looked at Naomi across the back seat of the car. She looked back at him. 22 hours, she said. He nodded. Then he opened the door. The lobby of Reeves Capital felt wrong in the way that familiar spaces feel wrong when something in them has changed, and you can't immediately identify what. Naomi noticed it before Daniel did, or maybe he noticed it at the same time, and simply knew what it meant. The security desk had 2 guards instead of the usual one. The woman at the front desk made eye contact with Daniel for a fraction of a second too long, then looked away. 2 men in suits were standing near the elevator bank in a configuration that wasn't waiting for the elevator. It was positioned, placed, the stance of people told to be somewhere for a reason. Daniel walked through the lobby without slowing down. Naomi stayed half a step behind him and watched the room. The elevator ride to the 31st floor was silent. The floor was quieter than it should have been at this hour. Some offices were dark. The ones that were lit had people in them who were working with the particular focused intensity of people who have been told to stay at their desks and not ask questions. One woman, late 30s, dark blazer, the kind of competent face that belongs to a senior coordinator, looked up as they passed and then immediately looked back at her screen, and Naomi caught something in that glance that looked less like recognition and more like relief. The relief of seeing the right person walk through the door before it was too late. Daniel stopped at the corner office. The door was open. The lights were on. Ethan Cole was inside. And he was standing at the window when they came in, looking out at the city with his hands in his trouser pockets, which was such a deliberate arrangement of casual calm that it announced itself as performance. He was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, with a face that had the easy authority of someone who had spent decades being the smartest person in most of the rooms he entered. He turned when he heard them, and his expression did something careful and brief before settling into something that was almost welcoming. "Daniel," he said, "I was wondering how long the restaurant would run." Daniel closed the office door. "Don't," Ethan said with a small smile before Daniel could speak. "I know what you're going to say. You're going to say I betrayed you, that I went behind your back, that I put everything you built at risk." He moved from the window to his desk and sat on the edge of it in the loose, unhurried way of a man who still believes the territory is his. And the honest answer to all of that is yes. And it was the right call. Daniel said nothing. Naomi stood slightly to his right and watched Ethan the way she had watched Victor, measuring, cataloging, listening for the shape of the argument before it arrived. "You've been running this company on caution for 6 years, Ethan said. Careful, considered, always another review cycle, always another risk assessment. You know how many global opportunities we've missed because you wanted more time to think?" He spread his hands. "The Al Sayed deal would have made this company dominant in a market segment you've been circling for a decade. I moved faster than you were willing to. That's the whole story." "The whole story includes a shell company and a forged authorization," Daniel said. "The authorization channel was legitimate," Ethan said. "I have executive-level access to it. That's not a forgery. That's a system working exactly as designed. You used it without my knowledge. I used it in service of the company's interests." Ethan's voice stayed even. "Which is what my role has always been." Naomi was watching his hands. They were still. No fidgeting, no defensive gestures. Ethan was not a man who was frightened right now. He was a man who had prepared for this conversation and believed he had the better argument. She looked at the desk behind him. There was a second laptop open, a stack of folders, and a printed document in a binding that looked very similar to the one that had been on the restaurant table. Not identical, different cover, but the same physical format, same size. She looked at it without pointing at it, without changing anything in her posture, and filed it away. "It wasn't in service of the company," she said. Ethan looked at her. He did it without surprise. He had known she was there, had simply chosen to address Daniel first, which was its own kind of statement. He looked at her the way men like Ethan look at people who don't fit the room they're standing in. Not hostile, but assessing, recalibrating whether she required engagement. "The arbitration clause routes every dispute to a body with pre-existing ties to Al Sayed's consortium," she said. "That's not a partnership. That's a structure designed so that Daniel's company loses every legal challenge from the moment the deal activates. If this was about making the company dominant, you'd want Daniel to have leverage. He doesn't have any. That's deliberate. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Daniel. Where did you find her? She found me, Daniel said. The deal would have made you wealthy, Ethan said, back to Daniel, dismissing Naomi with the redirect. Not powerless. There's a difference. You would have remained the face of the company. The revenue guarantees were real. The face, Daniel said. The name on the door, the face, Daniel said again. While you had operational control routed to a consortium, I can't legally challenge. Ethan was quiet for a moment. The name on the door is worth something, he said. Well, not as a justification anymore, just as a fact, offered plainly. It was the most honest thing he had said since they walked in, and it was also the most revealing, because it told Naomi exactly how Ethan had thought about Daniel throughout this entire process, not as a partner, not as a threat, as a brand asset, something to be retained for its value while the actual machinery moved underneath it. She looked at the document on the desk again. The signed version, she said. The Meridian filing. Is that a copy? Ethan followed her gaze to the desk. Something shifted behind his eyes. Very small, very controlled. Company records, he said. Can I look at it? No. She had already seen enough. The document was bound in the same format as the restaurant contract, which told her it was part of the same documentation package, which meant it had been produced by the same drafter, which meant it carried the same structural language, the same dual language architecture, the same interpretive framework, the same arbitration provisions. And if it was the same document with the same language, it had the same flaw, the one she hadn't told anyone about yet. She had found it while they were in the car. She hadn't been certain enough to say it aloud, not with Victor on the line, not until she understood it fully. But she had been turning it over since she first noticed it in the appendices, in the block of dense definitional text that most people would skim past because it looked like boilerplate. The definition of controlling party. In the Arabic version, the term was defined with a specific qualifier, a phrase that, in formal commercial Arabic, it restricted the definition to entities with a direct operational stake. The English version of that definition had dropped the qualifier, which meant the English and Arabic versions of the contract defined controlling party differently, which meant every clause that used the term, including the arbitration provisions, operated on different foundational assumptions depending on which version you read. If you could establish that the Arabic definition was the operative one, that the Arabic text was the document's primary source, and the English was the derivative translation, then the arbitration clause itself was structurally compromised. It was written on top of a definition that wasn't internally consistent across language versions. An inconsistency. A real one. Deep enough, specific enough, that a court or even the arbitration body itself would have difficulty dismissing it. But to establish which version was primary, she needed a confirmation. A statement on record from a party with standing in the deal that the Arabic text was the document's governing language. She needed Kareem. Daniel's lawyer arrived at 20 minutes past 6. She came in with a colleague and a laptop and the specific urgency of someone who had been moving fast for the last 2 hours. Her name was Sandra Briggs, early 50s, gray blazer, the kind of precision that comes from years of finding the exact thread that unravels things. She shook Daniel's hand, nodded at Naomi with the efficient acknowledgement of someone who didn't need an introduction to take someone seriously, and sat up at the conference table in the adjoining room. Ethan had not left. He was still in his office, the door between them left open by Daniel's instruction, a silent statement about who was running what in this building tonight. Naomi sat with Sandra and explained the definitional inconsistency. She walked through it slowly, in plain language, showing her the notepad pages. Sandra read everything twice. Then she pulled up the contract file on her laptop and cross-referenced it, scrolling carefully through the Arabic and English sections in parallel. She sat back and looked at Naomi. "If this holds," Sandra said, "the arbitration clause is effectively unenforceable. The whole activation mechanism depends on consistent definition of controlling party across both language versions. If the Arabic is primary, it has to be confirmed as primary," Naomi said. "By someone with standing." Karim al-Sayed. "Yes." Sandra looked at Daniel. "Where is he?" Daniel looked at Naomi. "Still at the restaurant," she said, "as far as I know." "We need him to confirm it," Sandra said, "on record that the Arabic text is the governing language, voluntarily, clearly, unambiguously. Without that confirmation, I can work with this, but it'll take weeks, and the activation happens in 19 hours, Daniel said. He had been tracking the time on his phone since the car. "Then we need to move tonight," Sandra said. Naomi thought about Karim, about the way he had watched her across that table all afternoon with those dark, unhurried eyes, about the phrase he had used that quoted the contract verbatim, about his closing line, "Now we can finally have an honest conversation," and what it implied about all the conversations that had come before it. She thought about what it would take to get him to confirm the interpretation. Not coercion, that wouldn't hold. Not appeal to fairness, because Karim had not constructed his position around fairness. He had constructed it around leverage and understanding, and the particular respect he seemed to have for whoever understood the game clearly enough to play it back. She thought she knew how to reach him, but it required going back. "I'll talk to him," she said. Daniel looked at her. "You think he'll cooperate?" She thought about the way Karim had watched her, the word he had said quietly that meant careful or precise, the fact that he had let her translate, let her find the clauses. He let the whole afternoon run to its conclusion without once trying to stop her. "I think he's been waiting for someone to ask him the right question," she said. "I think I know what it is." The office was quiet around them. Through the open door, she could see Ethan still at his desk, looking at his phone, managing something she couldn't read from here. Sandra pulled up a call interface on her laptop. "Tonight," she said. "All of it happens tonight." Naomi looked at her notepad. She looked at the underlined words. 19 hours, Meridian Holdings, the flaw. Then she looked at Daniel, and he gave her a single nod that meant, "I trust you." She picked up her pen. The restaurant was different at night. The same walls, the same lighting engineered to make everyone look important. The same cultivated hush, but emptied of its daytime crowd, it had a different quality, like a theater after the audience has gone home, and only the stage remains. The host who had seated Daniel's party that afternoon was gone. A younger man at the front desk looked up when Naomi pushed through the door, registered something uncertain in his face. She was still in her uniform, her notepad tucked under her arm, arriving at the building where she worked from the wrong direction at the wrong hour. And then Gregory Walsh appeared from somewhere in the back, and the uncertainty on the young man's face resolved into relief at having the problem transferred upward. Gregory looked at Naomi with the expression of a man who had spent the last 4 hours revising his understanding of the afternoon. "He's still here," Gregory said, and before she could ask. "Private room. He ordered dinner an hour ago. Hasn't asked for anything since." "Thank you," she said. Gregory stepped aside. He didn't say anything else. No reprimand, no questions, no reminder about the write-up she had almost certainly earned before whatever today had become had overtaken the normal order of things. He just stepped aside, and she walked through. Karim al-Sayed was eating alone. The contract folder was still on the table. She had half expected it to be gone, taken as evidence of something. But there it was in the same position she had last seen it, the leather cover closed now, pushed to the far edge of the table, the way you push something aside when you've finished with it, but haven't decided whether to throw it away. The pen was still on the linen, still uncapped. He looked up when she came in. He did not look surprised. "I wondered," he said in English, "whether it would be tonight or tomorrow." His English was clean, precise. The accent was present, but the command was complete, and hearing it now, after an entire afternoon of Arabic moving through Victor's distortion, and then through her own careful, uncertain translation, was like finally seeing the underside of something you'd only ever viewed from above. She sat down across from him without being invited to. She set her notepad on the table, and her pen beside it, and folded her hands. "You speak English," she said. "Fluently," he said. "Since I was 19. I studied in London, then in Boston." A pause. "I have given perhaps 4 interviews in English in my professional life. I find it clarifying. To conduct initial negotiations in my own language. People reveal more when they believe you depend on their translation." "And today?" she said. "What did today reveal?" He looked at her steadily. "That I was right to wait." She had thought in the car on the way back about how to approach this. She had gone through several versions: the appeal to fairness, the legal argument, the direct confrontation. She had set all of them aside, because Kareem was not a man who responded to pressure or sentiment. He responded to clarity. He responded to someone who understood the game well enough to name the pieces accurately. So she was going to name them. "The contract has a flaw," she said. "A real one. The Arabic definition of controlling party includes a qualifier that the English version drops. The definitions aren't consistent across language versions. That inconsistency makes the arbitration clause structurally unsound, because the arbitration clause operates on the definition, and the definition means different things depending on which text you read." She paused. "If the Arabic is confirmed as the primary language of the document, the activation mechanism fails. The meridian filing becomes legally vulnerable. Everything Ethan Cole built starts to come apart." Kareem was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with those dark, settled eyes, and she had the same feeling she'd had that afternoon, that she was being evaluated by someone who already knew the answer and was watching her work her way to it. "You found that today?" he said. "In the car," she said, "on the way here the first time." Something moved in his expression, a not surprise. She was beginning to think Kareem did not do surprise. Something more like satisfaction, the quiet kind that doesn't announce itself. "What do you need from me?" he said. "A confirmation," she said, "on record that the Arabic text is the governing language of the contract. Your lawyer can be present. Ours will be on the phone." She held his gaze. "One statement, clear and voluntary. That's all." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the contract folder at the edge of the table, then back at her. "And in exchange?" he said. "Nothing," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "I'm not offering you anything," she said, "because I don't think that's what this is about for you. I think you came to this table today knowing it was compromised. I think you let it run because you wanted to see whether anyone on Daniel's side understood enough to stop it. I think the test wasn't the deal." She paused. The test was whether the right person existed. The room was very quiet. Through the walls, she could faintly hear the kitchen, the last sounds of the evening service winding down, someone stacking sheet pans, water running. Kareem looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Call your lawyer." Sandra Briggs was on the phone in 4 minutes. She had been waiting. Naomi had texted her from the car, and her voice, when it came through, was the voice of someone who had been sitting at a table with her laptop open and her coffee going cold, running legal preparations for a confirmation she didn't yet have. Kareem spoke clearly and on record. He confirmed that the Arabic text was the original source document. He confirmed that the English version was a derived translation. He confirmed that in any interpretive dispute, the Arabic text had been understood by his party as the governing language from the contract's inception. He did it without hesitation, without qualification, without the careful hedging of a man protecting his position. When it was done, Sandra was quiet for a moment on the line. Then she said, in a tone that had shed most of its professional restraint, "That's enough. That is enough to work with." Naomi set the phone down on the table. Kareem poured himself a small amount of water from the carafe and drank it without ceremony. "Victor," Naomi said, "he switched sides today. Why did you let him?" "Victor made a calculation," Kareem said. "When he understood the filing had already been executed, he understood that his value to the original arrangement was spent. He switched because it was the rational move." He set the glass down. "I don't fault rational moves. Were you always planning to let it fall apart?" He considered this. "I was planning to understand it fully before deciding. Today accelerated my decision." He looked at her with something that might, on a different face, have been warmth. "You accelerated it." "I was just translating," she said. "No," he said. "You were understanding. That is considerably rarer." She thought about that. She thought about all the years of sitting at kitchen tables in other people's homes, absorbing language the way you absorb everything you really learn, through proximity and attention and the slow accumulation of listening. She thought about how many times she had understood something in a room she wasn't supposed to be in and had said nothing, had swallowed it, had kept it inside because the cost of speaking had always seemed too high. She looked at the notepad in her hands. "He said something else," Kareem said, "before you arrived, toward the end." She looked up. "He said," Kareem paused, choosing his words, "that this was never only about business, that the arrangement was also a kind of search." He folded his hands on the table. "For someone who truly understands how power moves through language, how meaning can be controlled or liberated depending on who holds it." He looked at her steadily. He was not entirely wrong about what he was looking for. He was wrong about where he thought he would find it. "Ethan," she said. Ethan believed power was structural," Kareem said. "Contracts, channels, authorization codes. He thought if you controlled the architecture, you controlled the outcome." He paused. He was not wrong about architecture, but architecture can be read by the right person. And a structure built to deceive a man who cannot read it is still readable. Naomi looked at the contract folder at the edge of the table, the uncapped pen beside it. "What happens to you?" she asked. "My consortium withdraws the arrangement through proper channels," he said. "The Meridian filing is challenged before activation. We reach a revised understanding with Daniel Reeves, a legitimate one, properly translated, with terms that hold in both languages." He almost smiled. "There are real business reasons I came to this table." "They remain real." "And Ethan?" "That is Daniel's matter," he said simply. "Not mine." She stood up. She picked up her notepad. She looked at him one more time, this man who had sat in this room all afternoon speaking a language he had pretended not to speak while a trap ran around him that he had let run, waiting, just waiting to see what would happen. "The phrase you used earlier," she said, "when I first challenged Victor, you said it quietly. I thought it meant careful or precise." He looked at her. "Which did you mean?" she asked. He considered it for a moment. "Both," he said. The Meridian filing was challenged at 11:47 that night. Sandra filed the motion with a supporting statement. Kareem's on-record confirmation, the documented definitional inconsistency, and a parallel submission from Victor Hale, who had driven to Sandra's office in person at 9:30 and spent 90 minutes giving a statement that was, by Sandra's account, the most organized and detailed account of a scheme she had heard from someone who had been inside one. He had names, dates, authorization trail documentation that he had kept copies of. He had kept copies. She thought about that later. The man who had spent the afternoon manipulating a contract had been keeping records the whole time. Not because he planned to use them, she didn't think it had been that deliberate, but because old habits of self-protection don't disappear just because you've made yourself someone else's instrument. The activation window closed at 9:14 the following morning. By then, the filing had already been suspended pending legal review. The reviewing body, the International Arbitration Authority that the contract had tried to install as the only available recourse, had received the motion along with a formal language inconsistency challenge that cited the definitional discrepancy across 17 dependent clauses. The challenge was accepted for preliminary review. It didn't collapse immediately. These things never do. But it stopped. It paused in place like a clock someone had reached out and grabbed mid-tick. And in that pause, there was room to work. Ethan Cole resigned at 8 in the morning. He submitted his resignation electronically from his office in a letter that was 3 sentences long and said nothing about anything. He was gone from the building by 9. His access credentials had been suspended by Sandra's team at 7 as a precautionary measure, which meant the last hour he spent at his desk, he spent without being able to open any of the systems he had controlled for a decade. Daniel told Naomi this at the coffee shop 3 blocks from Reeves Capital, where they met the morning after. She had gone home at midnight, back to her apartment, to her own kitchen, to the particular quiet of a space that is small enough to feel safe, and had sat for a long time at her table with a glass of water and her notepad in front of her, not writing anything, just sitting, letting the day settle. Daniel looked different in the morning. The suit was the same caliber, but different, a different shade, a softer cut, and something in his posture had shifted, the specific tightness of the day before replaced with something that was not quite relaxed, but was at least no longer braced. "Ethan is under investigation," he said. "Formally, his authorization of the Meridian filing without my knowledge or consent is a clear breach of fiduciary duty. His lawyers are already involved." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "There will be more, I think, when they pull the full record. This wasn't the first time he moved without telling me." She thought about the deals she didn't know about, the rooms she hadn't been in, all the things Victor had implied when he said Ethan had been running ahead of Daniel for years. "Are you going to be all right?" she asked. He looked at her. "The company is intact. The deal is suspended. Victor's documentation gives us enough to pursue the full scope of what Ethan did." He paused. "The damage is real, but it's survivable." Another pause, quieter. Because of yesterday." She looked at her coffee. "I want to offer you something," he said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "That's why I'm doing it." He set his cup down. "I want you to consult on international negotiations, not as a translator. I'll hire certified translators, professional ones, people with credentials and training, but as someone who reads rooms, who listens to what's actually being said rather than what's being presented." He looked at her directly. "You caught something yesterday that 4 years of professional due diligence missed. I don't know a credential that teaches that." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not qualified," she said. "For which part?" he said. "You translated a contract under pressure in front of 2 men who had every reason to want you to fail. You identified a structural inconsistency in a legal document that my own lawyers hadn't found. You went back to Kareem alone and got the one confirmation that made everything else possible." He paused. "Tell me the qualification you're missing." She didn't have an answer for that, which was its own kind of answer. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking," he said. She went back to the restaurant that afternoon, not because she had to. She hadn't heard from Gregory Walsh, didn't know whether she still had a job or whether yesterday had resolved that question permanently in one direction or another. She went back because it was Tuesday And Tuesday was her shift, and she didn't know how to be a person who simply didn't show up to the place that expected her. Gregory was at the host stand when she came in. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You're 3 minutes early," he said. She went and put on her apron. The shift was ordinary. She took orders. She refilled water. She brought out dishes and cleared plates and anticipated what tables needed before they asked for it, because that was the skill she had spent 11 months building in this building, and it didn't stop working just because yesterday had happened. Table 7 wanted more bread. Table 12 needed the check. The couple near the window were celebrating the same anniversary they had been celebrating when she was standing 2 rooms away, trying to decide whether to speak. She moved through it all with the particular quiet competence of someone who has learned that most of the time the work itself is enough, that you don't need the room to see you to do what you came to do. But near the end of the shift, filling water at a corner table, she heard it. A man at a 4-top near the back was speaking. She didn't know the language, not immediately, and then she did, a dialect she recognized without being able to name its region, and across from him a second man was translating for a third. And the translation was clean, she thought, accurate as far as she could follow it. She wasn't going to say anything. Then she heard the third man respond, and watched the translator give back a version of it, and the version was smaller than the original. Not wrong, but compressed in a way that changed its weight. She stood at the corner table with the water pitcher in her hand. She looked at the table, then she looked at the 3 men. The man being translated for, the one receiving the compressed version, was in the middle of nodding, accepting it, moving on to the next thing. She did not walk over. She did not interrupt. She stood there and watched the man nod and thought about all the rooms in the world where this was happening right now, all the gaps between what was said and what was heard, all the meaning moving through hands that weren't careful with it, all the things lost or altered or deliberately redirected between one person's mouth and another person's ear. She thought about what Kareem had said. This was a search for someone who truly understands how power moves through language. And then she thought about what Daniel had said. You're the only one who saw what no one else could. She set the water pitcher down on the service station. She straightened her apron. She walked across the floor toward the table with the 3 men, and as she approached, the translator looked up, a reflexive, slightly irritated glance, the look of a professional being interrupted by waitstaff, and she met it evenly. "Excuse me," she said to the man receiving the translation. "Before you continue, I just want to make sure you're hearing what's actually being said." Victor was gone. She learned this not from Daniel, but from Sandra, who mentioned it in passing during a call 2 days later. A call about documentation, about next steps in the legal process, about dates and filings and the slow machinery of consequences working through the system. Victor had left the city. No forwarding address, no formal notice, no statement beyond what he had already given. Well, he had collected whatever he needed to collect, and he had gone. She thought about what he had said at the end. He knew someone like Naomi might expose it. He wasn't a hero, just someone who stopped pretending at the right moment. She held that for a while, the specific honesty of it. The way it refused to make itself into something cleaner than it was. There was something almost respectable in that, in a man who looked at what he had done and named it accurately and didn't reach for a better story. She hoped he was all right. She wasn't sure why. She just did. 3 weeks later, Naomi Carter sat in a boardroom on the 28th floor of a building in Midtown. She was not in a waitress uniform. She was in a dark blazer she had bought the week before, with the notepad, the same one, the restaurant logo on the cover. He worn soft at the corners now, in her bag. Across the table sat 4 people, 2 of Daniel's representatives, a legal consultant, and a woman who had flown in from abroad to negotiate the terms of a revised infrastructure licensing agreement. The certified translator sat to the woman's left. He was professional, credentialed, trained. He had a portfolio and a certification card and a rate that reflected both. Naomi sat to Daniel's right. She was not there to translate. She was there to listen. The meeting ran for 2 hours. The certified translator did his job cleanly. She followed along, checking his work the way you check a sum you've already calculated, finding nothing wrong. The negotiation moved through its stages with the careful formality of people who all understood what was at stake and were choosing to be honest about it. Or near the end of the second hour, the woman across the table said something to her translator, a short phrase, quiet, almost an aside, and the translator rendered it as a minor technical clarification about the payment schedule. Naomi looked at the translator. He was already moving on, nodding, turning back to the main document. She looked at Daniel. He was watching her. She leaned forward, just slightly. "She said," Naomi said quietly, "that she'd prefer the payment trigger tied to delivery confirmation rather than shipment date. That's not a clarification. That's a negotiating position." The room paused. The translator looked at her. She looked back at him without apology. The woman across the table, who understood English, as it turned out, quite well, looked at Naomi for a long moment. Then she smiled. It was the kind of smile that means, finally. "Yes," the woman said in clear and careful English, "that is what I said." The last day of that month, Naomi received a message from a number she didn't recognize. It was short. No greeting, no signature. "You passed a test you didn't know you were taking. There will be others. K." She read it twice. Then she set her phone down on her kitchen table next to her notepad and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she picked up the pen and wrote at the top of a clean page, "What else am I not hearing?" She underlined it. Somewhere in a city she had never visited, a deal was being made in a language she didn't speak. Somewhere in a building she had never entered, a translator was choosing what to pass along and what to keep. Somewhere at a table like the table at Oleander's, a person was about to sign something they didn't fully understand. And somewhere in a boardroom with better coffee than she used to make, and a view she was still getting used to, Naomi Carter was learning to find the gaps. She was good at it. She always had been. 6 months after the afternoon that changed everything, Naomi walked into a negotiation in a hotel conference room in downtown Manhattan. New deal, new table, new players. The kind of room she used to move through with a water pitcher and an apron, visible only when someone needed something. She sat down. She listened. And when the translator finished his first pass, smooth, professional, almost right, she leaned forward in her chair, folded her hands on the table the way she had watched powerful people do it, and said, calmly and without hesitation, "Before you sign, you should know what's actually being said. How many times has someone underestimated you, and how many times did you let them just long enough to prove them wrong? If this story hit different, smash that like button and subscribe. We tell the stories they never see coming.